Good evening. My name is Barbara Velasquez. What a pleasure to welcome everybody back to Metropolitan Community College and its virtual programming. The summer academic term is underway. Thank you to MCC faculty who encourage your students that learning occurs outside their classrooms. And to our general audience, we warmly welcome you to our LGBTQIA+ Pride Month celebration. LGBTQ Pride Month is commemorated each year in the month of June to honor the 1969 Stonewall Uprising in New York City, when patrons and supporters of the Stonewall Inn staged an uprising to resist the police harassment and persecution to which LGBTQ Americans were commonly subjected. This marked the beginning of a movement to outlaw discriminatory laws and practices against LGBTQ Americans. Today, LGBTQ Pride Month celebrations are diverse and attract millions of participants around the world. In June and throughout the entire year, LGBTQIA+ Pride Month is an excellent time to learn about important people in history, read literature that features LGBTQ people, analyze heterosexism, and explore its causes and solutions. The 2021 national theme is "You Are Included." Your microphones are shut down during the presentation, but at any time during tonight's conversations, you may send your questions through the chat to moderator Barbara Velasquez, who will be sharing questions with our speaker. I will not share your names in order to encourage everyone to participate and ask your questions freely. The address for an online evaluation located at mccneb.edu/IIEEVAL will also be listed in the chat. Please share your feedback. So it was fun to hear from many of you who were so excited to have Cleve Jones present this evening. Beginning with the electrifying atmosphere of the 1970s San Francisco, Jones can speak to us about the gay liberation movement, his mentorship by legendary activist Harvey Milk, the terrifying early years of the AIDS pandemic, and his own rise to the forefront of activism as co-founder of the San Francisco AIDS Foundation and AIDS Memorial Quilt. He speaks as both a witness to history and as one who critically shaped it. Jones chronicles an era that forever changed both the fabric of our nation and the lives of millions of LGBTQ+ Americans. For 50 years, Cleve Jones has given a voice to the voiceless, organized the struggling and disenfranchised, and inspired activists and audiences with his life stories. He was recognized as a champion of change by President Obama and portrayed in an Oscar-winning film. His acclaimed keynotes connect the historic struggles of the past with the most urgent needs of our time: overcoming pandemics, achieving economic justice, protecting the vulnerable, and standing up for all forms of human rights. Please welcome Mr. Cleve Jones.
Great. I'm speaking to you from Sonoma County, California. I'm about 100 miles north of San Francisco. It's very beautiful here. I have been here mostly by myself since COVID started, but California is reopening this week, so I'm looking forward to resuming some sort of a normal life. I want to thank you for inviting me. I want to talk for a little bit about my life and some of the things that I've experienced, but I really hope that we can have a conversation. It would mean a lot to me if you have questions or just comments that you'd like to make, so please don't be shy. Pride Month is a month where this sprawling, diverse community we call LGBTQ++, uh, attempts to find some cohesion and unity, but it's often a time that showcases just how different we all are from each other in many important respects. And this has been one of the great challenges and great promises of this community and this movement. And of course, we have made real progress. And I, at 66 years old, can tell you that change is possible, and I've seen a lot of it in my life. None of it necessarily, however, is permanent, and most of it needs to constantly be defended. As much as we've made progress, I think it's important to begin our conversation by understanding that within a mile of where I'm sitting right now, and no doubt within a mile where each of you is sitting, some young person is getting ready to take their life. Some young queer kid, trans kid, who does not see a place for themselves in this world, does not see any possibility of love or hope or nothing. And I was one of those kids. I begin my book and end my book with a statement that the movement saved my life. That's not hyperbole, it's not rhetoric. When I was a 15-year-old boy in Phoenix, Arizona, I knew that what I was illegal, was considered sinful, was considered sick. I felt that my life was over before it had even begun. Both of my parents had some medical issues that year when I turned 15, and there were a lot of pain meds in the house, and I began to steal them one by one, very carefully so I wouldn't get caught, and I would hide them in a corner of my room under the carpet, because I knew that at some point, someone was going to find out who I was and what I was, and that there would really be only one way out. Looking back, I still am horrified by the thought that I was ready to kill myself at 15. And so when I encounter that kind of pain among young people today, it still evokes that same kind of horror and grief. But for me, I was saved. And what saved me was Life magazine, Year in Review, issue 1971, hiding out in my high school library, avoiding the bullies at gym class. And I'm just leafing through this magazine when I saw a headline that said homosexuals in revolt, and then followed 10 pages of articles and photographs about the new movement called the Gay Liberation Movement. I was completely astonished, and in one moment discovered that I was not alone. There were, in fact, other people like me, that there was a community for people like me. And not only that, but there was a movement for people like me, and that movement was part of the movement I had already joined, which was the movement for peace and for justice. So I went home that afternoon and I took those pills I'd been hiding and I flushed them down the toilet, and I decided I was going to get the hell out of Phoenix and go to San Francisco. I did that a year later when I finally graduated from high school, and hitchhiked up. I was kind of a clueless kid with long hair. I think I had $43 and I knew no one in San Francisco. But I went there as so many thousands of young queer and trans kids were doing the same from all over the country and all around the world. Every day, more and more of us were arriving. And I was extremely fortunate in that I just by chance met some of the greatest pioneers and leaders of our movement. Women like Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, who started the first lesbian organization in the world. Jim Foster, the first out gay person to speak to a national political convention, who spoke to the Democratic National Convention in 1972. I also met Harvey Milk, who was very, very kind to me and took an interest in me and mentoring me. I wanted to say a little bit about Harvey because now that he's been mythologized, and played by Sean Penn, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that he was, in most respects, a very ordinary man. He was certainly not a saint. He was not a genius. In his life, he experienced all of the defeats and humiliations and tragedies that most of us endure within our own lives. His personal life was always in disarray. He was a terrible businessman, but he changed the world. And I think it's important to remember that he was an ordinary man, because then I think it becomes easier for us to understand that everything he accomplished, those are all things that we in our own lives can aspire to. He had a great capacity for empathy. And I think that was probably one of the most important things that I learned about him, campaigning with him, watching him work in the bus stops, going to the senior centers, the union halls, talking to the rich white socialite ladies from Nob Hill and the homeless people pushing shopping carts. He had an incredible ability to meet you, to look at you, to listen to you, to hear you, and find some common ground on which he could build a conversation and eventually find a way that maybe we could work together to try to make our city a better place. So it was a great experience for me. And he'd already run for office 3 times, but he said that it was important for me to go back to school, and he bribed me basically with an internship offer. He said, if you'll cut your hair and go back to school, I'm going to take you with me to City Hall, and you can earn credit for working with me on gay rights issues. So that was, you know, an irresistible offer, and I accepted. I went to school, and he won his election and took me with him as promised to City Hall. And I got to work with him for 11 months. Most of it was just on the sort of boring everyday stuff that city councils and boards of supervisors have to do, addressing an unsafe intersection with a new crosswalk, or finding funding for a mental health program, or trying to find the way to clean up a park. But I also got to work on San Francisco's gay rights ordinances, which was one of the first in the nation. I had 11 months with him. And then on November 27th, 1978, I went into the office early because it was Thanksgiving week and his paid staffers were out of town visiting their families. I wanted to show how useful I could be. And as it turns out, I'd left a file back at my apartment that he needed, and he was annoyed with me and said so, and said I had to go back to my apartment and get the file. And he could see that I was crushed by this, and he apologized and said, I'm sorry, you know, it's just been a really stressful week. Go get the file and get some lunch and come back and we'll get some work done this afternoon. So I left and went back to Castro and got the file. And as I was walking down the street, I saw a picket line in front of one of our local restaurants being picketed by the union that I now work for today. It's called Unite Here, the Hospitality and Restaurant Workers Union. And so I took a few turns on the picket line, and while I was doing that, a bus pulled up and a woman yelled out the window, Cleve, someone shot Mayor Moscone. George Moscone was a very charismatic Italian-American elected official. He and Harvey really kind of dreamed up the notion of the progressive coalition to bring feminists and the people we now call LGBTQ and African Americans and Chinese Americans and Latinos and environmentalists and trade unionists together to build a coalition that could take power. And I couldn't imagine who would want to kill George Moscone. I was horrified by the news, so I grabbed a taxi and got to City Hall as fast as I could. The mayor's office is on the eastern side of the building, and I went in on the western side and went looking for Harvey and ran down the hall calling, Harvey, Harvey, where are you? And then I turned a corner and saw him on the floor. I had never seen a dead person before. You know, it's, I'd never seen up close what bullets do. And all I could think was, it's over. It's just all over. He was like my dad at that point. My own father and I had yet to reconcile. He was one of our leaders. He was my neighbor. He was a kind, good, decent man, and I loved him. And all I could think was, it's over. It's just all over. And we were kind of trapped in the office for several hours as they bundled up the bodies, and we played the audio tape he had recorded because he anticipated his assassination. I used to make fun of him and tell him he wasn't important enough to get shot. He wasn't Dr. King. He wasn't a Kennedy. And there he was, dead on the floor while we're listening to his voice on the audio tape. And I just kept thinking, it's over, it's over. It's just all over. And then the sun went down and people began to gather on Castro Street, Harvey Street. And they were gay and straight and young and old and black and brown and white and immigrant and native born. And we lit candles, 30, 40, 45,000 people. And we marched in silence down Market Street to City Hall and filled Civic Center Plaza with the light of our candles. And it was then, you know, standing in the midst of that huge crowd of people that I realized I was wrong. It most certainly was not over. It was really just beginning. The murderer, Dan White, went on trial. He was a former cop, a former firefighter. He was also a former member of the Board of Supervisors who'd run on a campaign to rid San Francisco of social deviance. And somehow in San Francisco in 1978, they managed to impanel a jury that was all white and all heterosexual. And the murmurings began already. He's going to get away with it. He's going to get away with it. And then on May 21st, 1979, a day before Harvey's birthday, the verdict came out, and Dan was convicted of manslaughter and would serve just 5 years in prison as a result. As word spread of the verdict, people again gathered on Castro Street, but we weren't carrying candles that night. And we stormed City Hall in a fury, burned every police car we could find. The police retaliated and attacked the Castro, and it ended up being the most violent episode in the entire history of the LGBTQ movement. I was accused of inciting the riot and summoned before a grand jury. And I don't really offer this as career guidance, but as it happened, following the riots, I got offered a job by the Speaker of the California State Assembly to work in our capital, Sacramento. So I moved, and I didn't really know what I was doing and had no real experience with legislation, and certainly not with public health issues, but I was assigned to the Health Committee. So my job there was to look at all of the bills that were coming before the Assembly Health Committee and to do my best to help the members prepare and to also to communicate what the Democratic leadership position was on these issues. And because I didn't know anything about these issues, I first subscribed to every sort of public health journal and publication that one could imagine. And among those was the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, published by the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. And so it was there, almost exactly 40 years ago, that I read the first few paragraphs describing clusters of gay men in San Francisco and New York and Los Angeles, whose immune systems seemed to be collapsing and who were dying of rare opportunistic infections. That was the first word we had. That was June of 1981, 40 years ago. I clipped it out and stuck it to my bulletin board. I just had a feeling that this was something really dangerous. Within 4 years, everyone I knew was dead or dying or caring for someone who was dying. I got a call from a doctor named Marcus Conant, who was a dermatologist at the University of California, San Francisco. He took me to visit one of his patients, a young man from Mexico named Simon Guzman. Simon was not conscious. We had to wear hazmat suits to go in and see him, but that was the first time I saw what this virus did. And later that day, Dr. Conant took me out to dinner and explained that he thought that it was a new or previously unidentified virus, that it was probably transmitted sexually, that it destroyed the immune system, that if we couldn't find a treatment, it would be fatal. And I absorbed that information and said to him, well, then, we're all dead. And he said, quite possibly. Whenever I talk about the early days of HIV/AIDS, there's one point that I think needs to be stressed over and over and over. We failed. We as a nation failed. We, the nation that had the advance warning, the resources, the knowledge, the institutions, the money, we failed to respond. We had a president who did not speak of AIDS publicly until more Americans had died of it than died in the entire Vietnam War. And when people did speak of it, they spoke of it in hateful ways, with bumper stickers that said, AIDS, it's killing all the right people. And I think it's important to every now and then to contemplate the consequences of homophobia. And in this case, one consequence of homophobia turned out to be the deaths of tens of millions of heterosexual men and women and their children. Because of course, there's no such thing as a gay virus any more than there's any such thing as a Chinese virus. But that initial bigoted, hateful, homophobic response stopped us from acting. And then, to make matters worse, when we began to understand that not just gay people were getting sick and dying, they were Black-skinned immigrants from Haiti, sex workers in New Jersey, IV drug users in cities all across the country. And that combination of homophobia and racism turned out to be truly lethal, deadly blend. And I am still angry about it. And our experiences of the last 15, 16 months, you know, it's like I've been to this rodeo before. It's pretty disheartening to see the same old stupid mistakes being made again and again, and to see once again the racial disparity in health outcomes play out right before us. So I'm still angry, and I think more people should be angry and more people should remember these lessons. By 1985, 1,000 people had died in my neighborhood. I knew most of them. They were my friends, they were acquaintances, the mailman, the bus driver, the baker, boys I went to school with, boys I fell in love with, boys I went dancing with, dying in their mid-20s, horribly hideous deaths. And there was no response. You know, we were really on our own. We had to create infrastructure to care for the sick and comfort the dying. It was a terrible, terrible time. And if I walked you down Castro Street today, I could tell you a story behind every building. You know, there's where Henry died. That's where George died. That's where Billy committed suicide. That's where Alan starved to death because people forgot him and he was too weak to get food. And I became more and more obsessed with this notion that my friends and I were all going to die and the rest of the world wasn't even going to blink, and that we would all be forgotten. And we were all struggling to find a way to warn the world of what was coming and to grieve and to try to save our lives. And we were on our own. No one helped. November 27th, 1985, we're holding the candlelight march that we do every year to remember Harvey Milk and George Moscone. And I pick up the local newspaper and read the headline that 1,000 dead are already of AIDS. And I was just so overwhelmed by that. And I remember saying to my friend Joseph, we were walking up and down the street, putting up posters, reminding people of the annual candlelight march. And I said to Joseph, you know, I wish we could knock down these beautiful Victorian homes. Maybe if this was a meadow with 1,000 corpses rotting in the sun, then maybe people would see it and they would understand it. And if they were human beings, they would be compelled to respond. But of course, there was no response. And I got obsessed with this idea of evidence. So that night when we marched for Harvey and George, I had everybody carry signs with the names of their friends who had died. People were reluctant at first to write them down, but I had Harvey Milk's old bullhorn and I had a stack of poster board and a sack of markers, and I said, write down the names of your friends and your loved ones, your neighbors who have died. And finally, people began to write their names, and we carried these signs with our candles down Market Street to City Hall. And then I had everybody go another 2 blocks to the old Federal Building, which housed at the time Reagan's Health and Human Services West Coast Division offices. And I'd hidden some extension ladders in the shrubbery. And when the cops weren't looking, we climbed up with big rolls of tape on our hand and we covered the whole front gray stone facade of this building with this patchwork of names. And I got off my ladder and I walked through the crowd. It was a cold night, kind of drizzly, light rain, and no songs, no music, no chanting, no speeches, just thousands and thousands of people standing in the rain and reading these names on this gray stone wall and whispering to each other. I knew him. I went to school with him. I didn't know she was sick. Nobody told me. I wish I could have said goodbye. And you could just feel the yearning, deep need find a way to grieve together and to find a way to warn the world of what was coming. And I walked through the crowd, and then I looked back at that patchwork of placards on the wall, and I thought to myself, it looks like some kind of quilt. I don't know what you think of when you say the word quilt. I think of my grandma and my great grandma and the quilt she made back in Bee Ridge, Indiana, when she learned that my mother was pregnant with me, the first great grandchild. It was such a warm, comforting, middle American, traditional family values kind of symbol. And I believe in traditional family values, and I want them to apply to me and my queer family. So that was the idea. And everybody told me it was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard of. They said, oh, that sounds morbid, or that sounds really complicated, Cleve, or that's expensive, and you're not going to be able to do this. No, that's a bad idea. And whenever any young person gives me the time of day, I always say, listen, if you ever have that happen to you, where you have something in your heart that you know you have to do, when you have an idea, when you have a dream, when you have a vision, and everybody tells you that it totally sucks, please tell them to and do it anyway. Trust your heart, trust your instincts. And then shortly after that, my best friend died, and his name was Marvin Feldman, and he died at his parents' home in Providence, Rhode Island, and I made the first quilt in his memory. And it became the world's largest community arts project. And the last time it was displayed in its entirety, it covered the entire National Mall in Washington, D.C., from the steps of the Capitol to the Washington Monument. Tens of thousands of people participated in sewing the panels. Hundreds of thousands of people volunteered at the displays of the quilt around the world. Millions of people, hundreds of millions of people ultimately would come to hear the quilt's message of unity and solidarity and compassion and resistance. And it is still growing today. I myself didn't get sick until 1992. By 1993, I was very sick. I was losing my hair and my vision. I had trouble walking. I had pneumocystis pneumonia. I began to waste away. And then ACT UP stormed the FDA and the NIH and got the medications released that would save my life. People remember ACT UP for the drama in the streets and the visuals and the civil disobedience, and that was all a big part of what they did. But what ACT UP also did was to engage the scientific community and the pharmaceutical industry and change the way these medicines were researched so that people who were dying could get access, expanded access. The drugs that saved my life wouldn't be approved for another 2 years. So had it not been for ACT UP's work, I would not be here talking to you. And that, again, is not hyperbole or rhetorical. That is simply the truth. The movement saved my life. In the years since then, I've continued my work, but for the last 15 years, I've worked primarily within the labor movement. I work for an organization called Unite Here. Prior to COVID, we represented about 350,000, mostly low-wage workers. Most of our members are women. Most are immigrant women, women of color, women from Southeast Asia, from Central America, from Africa, from the Caribbean. Think of the women who clean the hotels where you stay when you're traveling. That's who our members are. And it's been an extraordinary opportunity for me, because in a world that seems increasingly fragmented, and to be on the, to travel in queer progressive circles, it just feels to me that every year we're more and more siloed into our separate little domains. But we don't do that in Unite Here. Our members speak probably over 100 different languages, and the bosses would like to keep us divided. If you go to a hotel lunchroom for the workers, and you'll see there'll be a table where the Black workers sit, there's a table where the Latino workers sit, there's a table where the Asian women sit, and the bosses want to keep us divided because it's easier to pit us against each other, but we don't do that. We refuse to be divided by race or language or faith or sexual orientation or gender. We fight and we take on some of the biggest corporations in the country, in the world, and we win substantive victories. And those women that clean the rooms in those hotels go home with more money in their pockets. They have better health care. They're working in safer conditions. They can put their kids through college, and they're treated with more respect and given more dignity. So it's just been a wonderful gift for me to be able to be part of a struggle where I actually get to win victories that transform people's lives and raise families out of poverty. And it's kind of an antidote to the cynicism that is so pervasive in our society today. I'm very proud of my union. And you should also know that by this time last year, 98% of our members were laid off. And because most of them had their health care tied to their jobs, in the middle of a pandemic, not only did they lose their jobs, they lost their health care. So what did they do? By the thousands, they signed up to go register voters and do canvassing in a state called Georgia and helped turn that state blue. So I'm just so proud of the strength and resilience of our members and their families also. The most recent exciting news in my life is that the AIDS Quilt, which had been living in Atlanta for 19 years, thanks to the late Representative John Lewis and Speaker Pelosi, the Quilt has been returned to San Francisco and has a new home with the people who run the National AIDS Memorial Grove in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. And we are going to build a center for health and social justice that will be a permanent home for the Quilt. If you'd like to learn more about that effort, you can go to nationalaidsmemorial.com. And I'm excited. And I think that as I mentioned earlier, the reality of COVID just has underscored for me what I already knew, which was that these lessons that we attempted to learn out of the HIV/AIDS pandemic are just as relevant today as they were 40 years ago. And it is a shame that we as a society did not really heed that terribly well. So I always like to end my talks with an anecdote that I share almost every time I speak, but I'm very interested in hearing from you. I hope you all have questions or comments, and don't quite know how we're doing this. If you put them in the chat or what, Barbara will tell us, but speak up, please. I hope you will participate in this.
Cleve, we have some great questions coming in.
Great.
So I'm just kind of sorting them out, and let me share with you. You spoke of going to San Francisco young, without a lot of money, etc., and that many people were doing that at the time. A general question: did people take people in, or how did all these newcomers survive?
Well, ABC did a mini series based partly on my book called When We Rise, and the first 2 episodes really focus on it, this massive influx of young people. It had actually begun, of course, in the 60s with the whole Summer of Love experience and the hippie thing and the Haight-Ashbury, and then that sort of tapered off, and then the great gay migration happened. And at that time, it would, there'd be 6 people piled into a small hotel room or apartment. There was a lot of communal living situations, but I was homeless for months before I could find any kind of stable housing. And it's so interesting to me to see the transformation, and this out of that desire to find community and housing and friendship and the rest of it grew the neighborhoods. This became sort of a model that was repeated not just across the United States, but around the world, where the people now called LGBTQ would settle in specific areas. And these were usually parts of inner cities that were being abandoned by white middle-class people as part of the phenomena called white flight. So the population of San Francisco was declining after World War II. It declined in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. And it left these areas where gay people could move in, have clubs, reasonably affordable housing. And those areas became cauldrons of creativity, political activism, and places where we learned how to take care of each other and build the social service infrastructure. And one of the things that concerns me now is the reality that the young queer and trans kids that are fleeing to the cities, the neighborhoods are no longer there to welcome them, because that property has become some of the most expensive property in the world. So it's very, very different from when it was then, but it was incredibly exciting and often frightening, but very romantic as well.
Thank you. So you spoke quite a bit to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, but just to pull that out a little bit more, do you feel deja vu and PTSD having experienced that? What parallels do you see with the COVID pandemic?
Well, of course, the pathogens are very different. HIV is a retrovirus, and it can be doing its work in your body for years or even decades before you know it. But then at some point, it attacks the T cells, which direct the body's immune system. So at some point, then your immune system begins to decline. It leaves you vulnerable to all sorts of opportunistic infections. That's very different from the coronavirus, which, you get it, and either you have no symptoms, or you have mild symptoms, or you have severe symptoms. So the diseases themselves are very different. And HIV untreated is fatal, unlike COVID. But my goodness, the way we responded, a few of the things that really stand out for me is the importance of trusted messengers, the still extraordinary ability of people to deny science and deny reality, and the ever-present urge to make it about other people. I happen to have Asian American people in my family. The first time I heard Trump call it Kung Flu, I felt like a jab in my stomach, because I knew this would lead to violence against people I love. AIDS brought out the best in a lot of people, but it brought out the absolute worst in others, and COVID has done the same thing. With HIV, we also had a whole denialist movement. There are still people around who say HIV doesn't exist, and it's just sort of mind-numbingly awful to realize that there are people out there that can be so freaking stupid. It's been very tough for me this last year and a half, and I find that it's kind of a lot of my old anger has kind of bubbled back up, and I have no patience for people who don't understand the science, who won't get vaccinated, who won't wear a mask in a confined indoor space. It's just, it's been tough.
Thank you.
I need to say also,
yes.
I don't know if you can hear that, my next door neighbor's mule is braying. To see the racial disparity coming, once again, we see that Black and brown people are more likely to get infected. Again, we see they are less likely to access quality care. Once again, we see they are more likely to die. And that kind of, deep, deep systemic problem, we are nowhere near where we need to be on challenging that. And COVID has just brought that out. I don't hear many of the politicians talking about it anymore, but it's shameful. It's really shameful.
I appreciate your adding those points. Very important. So when I talked a little bit about allies earlier today, and we have a question. What do you suggest we do now going forward? How can we be of support? What actual individual actions or group actions do you suggest?
Well, there's a few things mixed up in there, but first is I grow weary of the endless conversation about allyship. I'm kind of over it. During World War II, the Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship, and the United States was ostensibly a liberal democracy. The Soviet Union was run by a cruel dictator named Joseph Stalin, and the United States, we elected a relatively progressive Democrat named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And they were allies in the fight against Hitler's Germany. I think of allies as people, organizations, communities of different values who come together at specific points in time to address specific issues in specific places and then go their own way. I'm not looking for allies. I'm looking for co-conspirators and colleagues and partners. And I think that, maybe this is just me being old school, but I believe in the movement. And when I talk about the movement, I'm talking about the broad global movement for peace and for justice and to save the planet and learn how to share it equitably. Now, there's so many fronts on in that fight. There's the fight of women. There's the fight of my community. There's the fight against racism. There's the fight for working people. There's the fight to save the planet. There's the fight to save indigenous cultures. But this, in my view, this is all the movement. And I am not an ally of the peace movement. I am part of the peace movement. I'm not an ally of the feminist movement. I am a feminist. I am not ever standing on the sidelines. Now, as for what should people do, I get this so often from younger people wanting to know, how can they be more effective? What are the most appropriate actions they can take? And I would encourage you to kind of step back from that question a little bit and look inside yourself, because I think that every single one of us has something unique and powerful and wonderful that we can bring to this effort. And it's important to take enough time to look at oneself. And just as we know now more clearly that all of us learn things in different ways, some of us need to see it, some of us need to touch it, some of us need to hear it, some of us need to read it. And so we all have different, gifts. Some of us like to talk. Some of us like to write. Some of us want to make art. Some of us want to do research. Some of us are the mediators. Some of us are the flamethrowers. So I would say start by just looking in within yourself and find out what you want to do to help and find a way to contribute, as I have, that brings you joy, because then you can endure. And I'm often asked, now that I'm so old, what are you most proud of? And I'm proud that I've endured. I'm still doing this. And I do it because the work I do connects me to the most wonderful people on the planet. And it keeps my life filled with joy and hope. And it's an antidote to the cynicism that's all around. So pay attention to yourself and find a way to contribute that brings you joy. Also, you deserve to be happy. And when you are happy, you communicate that and you lead by example, and don't be doing this, bring people along with you by showing them the joy of the work.
Another question. It's baffling that they still don't teach LGBTQ plus history in schools. Kindergarten through 12th grade, I didn't learn a single thing from our public school system. Keeping the younger generation educated like this is important if we are to continue to carry the torch and continue to fight with the same fire and fuel that you fought with.
We teach it in California. It was a long fight, but yeah, and it's to this point also the issue of what gets into textbooks generally when the biggest purchaser is Texas. Yeah, it's disheartening, and I think equally disheartening is the notion I encounter where people just feel like these fights have been won and are over. I just recently was on a panel where they said, well, now that the gay community has won marriage equality and are no longer banned from the military, is there anything left to fight for? Every victory we achieve can be ripped away from us in the blink of an eye. I know women who never imagined that abortion would again be outlawed in this country, and we are this close to that right now. Yes, we've achieved marriage equality, but look at the Supreme Court. So look at what Georgia has done this week to voting rights. Everything we win has to be defended. This isn't, and this goes back to my earlier point about finding a way to contribute that allows you to endure, because the things we're fighting for, we don't win these in a week or a month or a year or a decade or a generation. This is a multi-generational struggle that must continue and constantly be replenished. And so that, this issue of, my community's history not being taught in schools is part of this. We need to fight for that so that people can have the information and the historical perspective that will give them the strength and the strategies to keep moving forward and defending the gains that we make.
This comment question kind of ties into that. The individual presents that in Nebraska, a same-sex couple were finally able to adopt their daughter, who they raised since birth, after a judge turned them down a year ago. There seemed to be moments of victories for the community, but also many laws being enacted to restrict the community, especially the transgenders community, with laws against participating in sports, using bathrooms. Do you see the same type of activism happening now by ordinary citizens as in the past?
Well, some aspects of it are different, but I'll tell you one thing that remains unchanged is you look, decade after decade after decade, you see right-wing Republican conservatives cloaked in Christianity, supposedly, making political points for themselves by attacking vulnerable people. They did it to me and mine during AIDS. You look at all the extraordinary challenges this country faces: the climate crisis, the growing gap between rich and poor, crumbling infrastructure, a pandemic, and these Republican majority legislators are focused on abusing trans kids. It's a very cynical ploy, and it works with a certain portion of our population. It's why we all have to be part of keeping the fight going and finding that way to contribute that we can sustain.
Cleve, could you speak to the Ryan White Foundation? Tell a little bit about that.
Well, I don't know much about the foundation's work currently. I know that Jeannie White, Ryan's mom, is a wonderful woman. I consider her a friend. Ryan White was a very brave little boy who had hemophilia, and this is one part of the AIDS pandemic story that has largely been forgotten, that an entire generation of hemophiliacs was pretty much wiped out because of the contamination of the blood products that they use to stay healthy. There's so many different parts of the AIDS pandemic that people are just oblivious to, and especially in this country where we still think of it as a gay disease. I spent 8 weeks in South Africa working on clinics there, and to see the just appalling impact of HIV/AIDS on heterosexual men and women in particular and their children. It's just, again, people remember what they want to remember and forget the rest, and it's to everybody's detriment. I did not know Ryan. I did not ever have the chance to meet him, but I was very grateful to him for his bravery and the legislation that bears his name, the Ryan White Act, which was a bipartisan bill supported and signed by a Republican president, provided a lifeline of support, particularly to the cities that were hardest hit by the pandemic and struggling during the really awful time before treatment. We went a full 10 years before we had any kind of effective treatment. I lived with the knowledge that I had the disease for 10 full years before any kind of treatment became an option for me. Can we do 2 more?
2 more, okay. So let's see. We have a lot of people thanking you. I'm going to take this one. Let's see. Nebraska is a conservative environment where the work and educational worlds still tolerate religious expression. Can you speak to activism within an organization versus against an organization?
Well, I think that to study the LGBTQ movement, I think one would get some amazing examples of people who refused to accept the rejection of their churches and have worked diligently decade after decade to change their church's position. I was fortunate. My background was Quaker, the Society of Friends, who were performing commitment ceremonies for same-sex couples in the 60s, and were very supportive. But so many of my friends have chosen to stay and fight within those institutions, and it's not something I would have the patience to do, but I really respect it. And it's yet another example of how the victories we're after don't happen overnight. And I don't want to make any sort of broad stroke characterizations of an entire generation, but I think a lot of the younger people just don't understand how long you have to fight to get some of this stuff. And I'm always saying to younger people, I want you to demand everything immediately. I do, because only then is there any hope of us getting anything eventually. But these kinds of things take time, and I have a great deal of respect for people that do that work to change those institutions. I just looked at the clock, and I want to close out with a story that I share with everybody. It's about the quilt, and I also have to go inside because now the mosquitoes are joining the flies. There's the quilt when it covered the mall in Washington, D.C. when we first displayed the quilt in 1987, we went back to San Francisco, and we had yet to show the quilt to San Francisco, and the city gave us the George Moscone Civic Auditorium, named after Mayor Moscone, murdered with Harvey Milk all those years before. And all the school districts bussed in their kids to be part of the opening ceremony and the reading of the names. And the workshop on Market Street at Castro was empty. Almost all the panels of the quilt had been taken down to the display. The sewing machines were off, the radio was off. And after the opening ceremony, I wanted some time alone. So I went back to the workshop, and I was just sitting in the back, going through the bills, figuring out which ones I had to pay, which ones I could stall. And I got that sensation that I was being watched. And I looked up and I saw an old woman standing on Market Street, peering in through the plate glass windows. She was African-American, dark brown skin, very deeply lined. She looked to be in her 70s probably, wearing a pale blue dress. I went and I opened the door and I said, "You can come in and look around, but the quilt is down at Moscone Center, and I can call you a taxi or show you how to get there by bus." And she crossed her arms and looked down and wouldn't say a word to me, just scowled. So I let her be. She walked around and spent some time by the shelves with the fabric and thread that had been donated. She sat at a sewing machine for a while. She looked at some of the leaflets on how to make a quilt panel. And then without saying a word, she got up and walked away. Several days passed. The quilt display at Moscone Center was concluded. The workshop once again was filled with people. The radios were on, the sewing machines were going, people crying as they shared memories over here, people laughing as they shared memories over here. And in the midst of all of this, typical chaos of the quilt workshop, the door opens and this woman walks in again. She's wearing the same blue dress. She's got the same scowl on her face, her arms still crossed, but in her arms we see a piece of fabric. She told us she'd come on a Greyhound bus from her little hometown in Kentucky, and that earlier that year, her firstborn, her oldest son, had come home from LA where he'd settled after serving in Vietnam, and he was sick. She cared for him by herself without ever revealing to another human being the nature of her son's illness. She was the matriarch of a large extended family. She told no one in the family. She had been choir director and still played piano at her church. She didn't tell the pastor or anyone in the congregation. And all by herself, this old woman cared for her son until his time was up. Many of you who are young may not have done this yet. It's hard. It's hard physically, it's hard emotionally, it's hard spiritually. And without any help, this woman cared for his son until his time was up. She said she rode with him in the ambulance to the hospital, which was only a short distance from her home. And she stayed there with him until he was gone. And then she walked home. When she got to her house, she opened the front door and walked into the living room and saw her son's bedroom door standing open. And through that door, she saw the towels and the pills and the IV rack and the bedpan, and she closed the door and locked it and never opened it again. Months passed, and she's waiting for a dentist appointment. Happens to pick up a back issue of People magazine and reads a story about the AIDS memorial quilt. And she went home and she packed her bags and she got on a Greyhound bus and traveled across the United States of America to the corner of Castro and Market in San Francisco and told us this story and handed the fabric that was in her arms and said, "This is my son. I have to go home now and clean out his room." I felt very proud and grateful then that we in San Francisco, who were mostly young and gay and white, had succeeded in creating this symbol that had found this old woman alone with her grief in the hills of Appalachia and connected her and her son and their love and their struggle with all the many different kinds of people all across the planet who in the course of fighting back against HIV/AIDS came to understand what a tiny planet it is that we inhabit and how irrevocably all of our lives are linked. That was the lesson we needed to learn from AIDS, was the message of the quilt. I think it's the most important message of all. We are linked. Our lives are irrevocably linked on this small planet that we inhabit and must cherish. So thank you very much for inviting me and for listening to me. And I hope you are all well and healthy and ready to fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cleve. You have an audience of very inspired and thankful people. I want to give you special thanks for accepting our invitation. And our lives are enriched. I have people telling me they're going to practice some of the things that you have shared with them. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Enjoy your beautiful home. I'm sorry about the mosquitoes, etc. But what a lovely, lovely evening you've created for us. And the audience, it's a great start in our programming for LGBTQIA plus Pride Month. Please note, if you can see there, When We Rise, this book, beautiful photo that Isaac helped us to find. And I don't know if the audience could see the quilt. Can you pull that up again, Isaac? He wanted you to see the vast beauty, and it's really an honor to be with the person who had the idea of this. So many of us have heard of the quilt, and many have gotten the chance to visit it. We have some audience members who did. So thank you. If I could just tell you, I want you to know that early on, one of our faculty said to me before the event that she keeps a quote in her phone that you gave, and it has helped her gain confidence in the many leadership positions that she's had both at our college and in the community. And the quote is, "My activism comes from my friends and community and loved ones. It's what I do. As far as I can tell, I have no other discernible skills." I thought you would be touched to know that has moved a very successful faculty member through the challenges that she faces.
Thank you. All right, I'm saying goodbye now.
Okay.
Take good care, everyone. Thank you so much.
Right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Isaac, thank you.